Here we go. Ukraine, what's going on? Wrong assumptions, wrong conclusions, and a lot of dead soldiers. Gross. Ew. Oh, again, we are anti-war. We're definitely anti-war here. We don't want to see anybody dying, and we think that a lot of this stuff is unnecessary because of all the things that they're going to talk about here. So, as the war in Ukraine passes the half-year mark, lots of media produce their conclusions about the beginning of the war. But when looked in detail, these are most superficial write-ups of what people assume Russia's plans are at the start of the war, and how those assumed plans fit with the presumed reality. And here's an example. The Washington Post has a long exclusive piece headlined, "The Battle for Kiev." Right? Ukrainian valor, Russian blunders combined to save the capital. And it first describes the immediate start of the war and then states a false assumption. All right. The question everyone faced at that moment, which is Ukrainian Interior Minister Montrasky said, how far can the enemy go with that enormous fist? All right. Reef, I'm getting feedback from you again. If the Russians could seize the seat of power in Ukraine, or at least cause the government to flee in panic, the defense of the country would quickly unravel, right? Moscow could install a puppet government. That was the Kremlin's plan, right? That's what the Washington Post is saying then. I don't know why the authors think they know what the Kremlin's plan was. I'm certain that the described one is not what Russia intended to strive for. A piece of Newsweek makes similar assertions. How Putin botched the Ukraine war and put Russia's military might at risk. Right, and here's what they say. This is out of Newsweek. Ukrainian defenders have indeed been ferociously determined, while Russian troops have had to contend with bad battlefield leaders, inferior weapons, and an unworkable supply chain. They've also been hobbled by Putin himself. He misread the world situation, and personally ordered a disastrous invasion, looking to overthrow the government in Kiev. All right. He directed a botched effort to take Donbass, depleting the Russian armed forces in the process. Of course, we all know. And they continue to say that Putin, like every other dictator we've known in the modern era, thinks he knows better, more than his own military and more than any experts. One senior intel who works on Russia and requested anonymity to speak frankly tells Newsweek. Of course, Newsweek. Okay. The February invasion was designed to overthrow Vladimir Zelensky and take over the entire country, and Russia deployed tens of thousands of troops in Belarus to Ukraine's north, threatening Kiev. Again, this is all coming out of Newsweek. This is not Moon of Alabama's analysis. They're going to debunk this in a moment. Okay. Given Russia's overwhelming numerical superiority, Putin expected the government in Kiev to fall in as little as 72 hours. There is no evidence that any of those assertions are true. At the beginning of the year, Russia faced a problem. In the larger picture, it had to prevent Ukraine's admission to NATO. Negotiations with the U.S. had failed to achieve that. In the immediate situation, Russia also had to prevent an immediate Ukrainian attack on the Donbas republics. Okay? There were several potential ways to achieve that, each which came with a different timelines, with a different timeline and price point. Yeah, it's definitely coming from your mic. At the beginning of war,
it's not.
Okay.
Anyway,
Putin made one remark to the Ukrainian military command to give up, to make the necessary concessions, and to remove the civil government should it not agree with that. But during the first days of the war, it became immediately clear that the Ukrainian military command did not want or did not dare to do that. This military coup would have been the cheapest and fastest solution for both Russia and Ukraine. Okay. The second option was to press the Ukrainian government into agreeing to Russia conditions to end the war, to remove the Ukrainian army from the Donbass, to accept Crimea as part of Russia, and to repudiate any NATO association plans. The move of Russian forces to around Kiev was designed to achieve that. Okay, it nearly reached that aim during talks held at the end of March in Turkey. As soon as the Ukraine seemed to agree to the Kremlin's conditions and to a potential summit, Russia ordered its troops to move back from the city. On March 29th, France 24 summarized its daily report collection with this, right? The Ukraine proposed adopting neutral status and a 15-year consultation period on the future of Russian-occupied Crimea, as long as a complete ceasefire with Russian forces is agreed, negotiators said at the conclusion of peace talks in Istanbul on Tuesday. Despite Russian vows to radically reduce military operations near Kiev and Chernihiv, Western officials urged caution. Of course they did. Kremlin's hope for a fast end to the conflict was disappointed when, a few days later, Zelensky suddenly refuted all the concessions the negotiators in Istanbul had made. This followed a phone call between the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Zelensky on April 2nd and Johnson's visit to Kiev on April 9th. A report in the Ukrainian Pravda described what happened, machine translation, that after the arrival of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson in Kiev, a possible meeting between Zelensky and Putin has become less likely. Two things happened, after which a member of the Ukrainian delegation had to openly admit that the meeting of the presidents was out of time. The first is the exposure of atrocities, rapes, murders, massacres, robbery, indiscriminate bombing, hundreds and thousands of other war crimes committed by Russian troops in the temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories. The second obstacle to agreements with the Russians arrived in Kiev on April 9th, meaning Boris Johnson. So details. According to Ukrainian parliament sources close to Zelensky, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who appeared in the capital almost without warning, brought two simple messages. The first is that Putin's a war criminal, he needs to be squeezed and not negotiated with. And second, if Ukraine is ready to sign any agreements on guarantees with him, then they are not. This position of Johnson testified the collective West, which back in February offered Zelensky to surrender and run away, now felt that Putin was actually not as all omnipotent as he was imagined, and that right now there was a chance to squeeze him. 3 days after Johnson left the UK, Putin went public and said talks with Ukraine have reached an impasse. The West, in form of Joe Biden's messenger, Boris Johnson, told Zelensky, first in a phone call, then in person, that he would be on his own if he should sign a ceasefire agreement that made any concessions to Russia. Basically putting, it totally puts Zelensky right in the middle, Russia's initiative to achieve fast concessions and its motive to keep troops around Kiev had failed because the West did not agree to it, Again, it wanted a long war to drag Russia down. And that's probably true. All right, Zelensky accepted the Western pressure for a war down to the last Ukrainian and ended the negotiations by making new demands that Russia could never accept, Since then, Russia removed its troops from the vicinity of the big cities, Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv. This to drag the Ukrainian troops away from the civilians in the cities into the countryside and to expose them to the massive artillery strikes that the Russians use along the front lines. They're trying to...
Congratulations. You
played yourself. That's right. There the Ukrainian troops get demilitarized and denazified just as Putin had ordered. Anyone who says that Russia is too slow and does not make progress along the front line misunderstands the situation. Russia is deliberately dragging the Ukrainian forces toward the rural front line to destroy them there without creating massive civil casualties. Well, that kind of makes sense, The Russian army has deliberately slowed down its advance to the special military operation in Ukraine in order to reduce civilian casualties, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said at a meeting of defense chiefs from Shanghai Organization member states on Wednesday. So Shanghai Cooperation, that's got to be something with China, right? Quote, "We strictly comply with humanitarian law during the special operation. Attacks are carried out with high-precision weapons on the Ukrainian Armed Forces military infrastructure facilities, including command points, airfields, depots, fortified areas, and defense industry sites. At the same time, every effort is being done to prevent civilian casualties. It certainly slows down the advance, but we do it consciously," Shoigu pointed out, Well, of course they're going to say that, but the following document is really original. If it's really original, this approach seems to be quite successful, because someone leaked an official report of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense about losses sustained. Again, there'll be a tweet here in a moment. Up to the 1st of July, According to the document, the losses of the Ukrainian military were over 76,000 dead, over 42,000 wounded, 7,200 captured, 2,800 missing, and another 1,600 non-combatant casualties, which, who knows? Wow. The total numbers look realistic to them. The number of dead is higher than their estimate, but the number of wounded seems to be low in relation to the dead.
Yeah.
Total numbers look realistic. Like it says, there may be several reasons for that. The evacuation of wounded soldiers from positions under artillery fire is extremely difficult, and Ukraine's military medical service is not exactly up to date. There's no helicopter evacs and no tracked medical transport vehicles that could take the wounded out.
Right.
A lot of wounded will thereby miss the golden hour and simply die before they can be brought into effective medical care. We can assume that the Ukrainian staff only counts the heavily wounded, and that people who get patched up and sent back to the front line are likely not included here. July 1st was in the 17th week of the war, and the total number of likely dead on the above list is 81,066. That makes for an average kill rate of 4,767 per week, or 681 Ukrainian soldiers per day. Again, cannon fodder. Why? As the first weeks of the war, again, there's some Nazis, but there's a lot of volunteer citizens that were forced into this. So, and again, we don't want to see anybody die for this, kind of, they're caught in the middle of a proxy war. As the first weeks of the war were not exceptionally bloody, the number of current dead per day is likely higher. 9 weeks have passed since the reference date of the above report. They've likely added another 42,000 dead to the list. These numbers are consistent with Russian military's daily clobber list, which reports several hundreds Ukrainian casualties per day due to airstrikes and well-targeted artillery. A recent New York Times piece about the costs of war also gives some numbers. So again, this is the commander of Ukraine's armed forces, through the New York Times, said Monday that about 9,000 Ukrainians had been killed at the front. This month, Pentagon officials assumed that 70,000 to 80,000 Russians had been killed or wounded. They put the number of deaths at 20,000. But wow. Those numbers are simply not believable, and here from the same piece is why. Analysts estimate that Russia's firing around 10,000 artillery shells a day, down from a peak of as much as 20,000 during the campaign to take Luhansk, and that Ukraine is firing several thousand artillery rounds a month. 10 to 20,000 rounds per day means some 450,000 rounds per month fired from the Russian side. The Ukrainian counterfire is down to several thousand artillery rounds per month. That is a ratio of 100 to 1. Now, I know we're also sending in weaponry, so does that count that? How the heck is that supposed to result in only 9,000 killed Ukrainians and 80,000 Russian casualties? It simply can't. Wow, I sound like William Shatner.
Mm-hmm.
The deliberately slow advance Shoigu describes as achieving the war aim of demilitarizing the Ukraine, while Russia's army takes a minimum of casualties.
Yep.
Most of the experienced younger officers, captains and majors, and the senior sergeants that were the backbone of the Ukrainian army will by now likely be dead. Together with the high material losses and high troop casualties, the Ukrainian army has taken this will make it less and less capable of any organized maneuver or resistance. All that's left is Ukrainian cannon fodder, which Russian artillery eats up with enormous ferocity. It's sad that it's come to this. 6 months. Automod held somebody's comment for review. Wow, look at that. Yeah, this is it's a hard story to get through. But we got to take our medicine a little bit. We got 4 not so great stories. But these are really, really big ones. And I know a lot of people talk about what's happening in Ukraine. I don't really see too many people referencing One of Alabama, but I think they're one of the best sources there is. I read them pretty consistently. There's a few, of course, people who are in country, people like Eva Bartlett, people like George. I'm blank down on his last name. He interviewed with Tara. You did that stream, right, Reef?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Sure.
I can't think of his last name. Sorry. Of course, people.
Who was it?
What?
Who was it?
George.
What you?
George.
Oh.
That Tara interviewed. I can't think of his last name. Eliason. George Eliason.
Yeah.
That's who it was.
it.
Sorry. Thank you.